and welcome everybody. This is Steve Sheehan from IBM. At IBM, my career has been spent as a human resources practitioner and a leader of sales teams providing HR service solutions. I'm proud to be a co-chair of the Atlanta chapter of IAOP. Our chapter serves a large, diverse, and growing population, and I'm delighted that so many of our members have joined us for today's program. We're also very pleased to welcome participants from many other chapters today as well. Today, the Atlanta chapter is launching a series of discussions about outsourcing, not as it's described in the public conversation, but as it is actually practiced by people in our industry. It is hard to avoid hearing negative opinions in the public media these days that seem to depict outsourcing as intrinsically harmful to people and economies. So we wanted to explore how we, who work in this industry as providers, advisors, or consumers of outsourced services, can engage in that conversation with pride in the work we do. I should say at the outset that while our attention to this topic may have been prompted by the public dialogue about outsourcing, this is a professional and not a political conversation. Our focus here today is on how outsourcing is done well in ways that benefit our clients, support our people, and propel sustainable economic growth for everyone. As soon as we started to think about beneficial outsourcing, we were led back to a foundational work on this subject, the Outsourcing Professional's Guide to Corporate Responsibility, whose authors, Ron Babin and Bill Heffley, have joined us today. Ron Babin is an associate professor at Ryerson University in Toronto. His research is focused on the social responsibility issues related to global outsourcing. His industry background as a management consultant with KPMG and Accenture spans most industries and several decades. In addition to teaching at the university, Dr. Babin is an adjunct researcher with the IT Executive Program at ITC and the chair of the Canadian Standards Committee regarding ISO 37500. Ron holds a doctorate in business administration from the Manchester Business School and an MBA from York University. Bill Heffley is a clinical professor in the Naveen Jindal School of Management at the University of Texas at Dallas, where he teaches in the largest IT master's program in the United States. He also teaches in executive programs in project management. He's a frequent lecturer on service science education, service innovation, and global services delivery. Both of our panelists are long-serving members of the Corporate Social Responsibility Committee at IAOP, and they were honored to be jointly named IAOP's Member of the Year in 2015. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks,
I thought we might start with some fundamentals for the benefit of those of our participants who might not be familiar with the work that you've done and continue to do. And Ron, I wonder if I could start with you and just ask you to define corporate responsibility and tell us why it is important to companies.
Sure. Thank you, Steve. Just want to check you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, thanks and welcome, everybody. What is corporate responsibility and why is it important to companies? Well, I'll answer the last part first. Why is it important? Because it's 2016, and it's almost impossible to imagine anybody working in a business or large organization environment that is not familiar with corporate social responsibility, CSR, or as we simply call it, corporate responsibility. We all have an obligation as businesses to pay attention to the communities and the people with which we work, as well as environmental issues, whether it be carbon or waste or other things that come from our course of business. We've been studying and writing about corporate responsibility and outsourcing for 8 or 9 years now. We'll get into some of the details later, but it's clear that the entire corporate world understands the importance of social responsibility. In fact, there are a number of standards, and I'm just going to mention 2 or 3 of them right now. The most prominent one is from the ISO organization, and it's ISO standard 26000 that defines how CSR should be thought of and structured. And in fact, we've used that as the basis for our surveys here at IAOP. The second one is the United Nations Global Compact, which talks about the importance of paying attention to social and environmental issues. And then finally, the Global Reporting Initiative, which is a standardized reporting structure for organizations that participate in CSR activities. So these are all well-established, well-regarded global standards that any reputable organization would participate. I might mention as well that there's a very recent, further evolution of some of these ideas. This one's coming from England, from the United Kingdom, and something called the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. So last year it was put in place, but it also recognizes the need for companies, at least that operate in the UK, to attest that as part of their physical and electronic supply chain, there is no, child slavery or slavery of any sort in the delivery of goods and services to that organization. So that's an interesting development. But I think most of us on this call would understand and accept that corporate responsibility is a fact of life if we're operating and doing business in 2016, sorry.
Thank you. I totally agree. In this section, Ron, when you're talking about this, and Bill, I would ask you to give us this as well. The book cites the concept of the triple bottom line as one artifact of corporate social responsibility. Bill, could you tell us what that is?
Sure. The concept that a lot of people have talked about regarding corporate responsibility goes back to some work that was done years ago by an economist that said a corporation's sole purpose is to deliver return to its owners. In other words, profits. And that view has morphed over time to really take a broader view that says we cannot just return profits. We also need to think about where we live and where we work and the impact on our planet. That's the second P. And then we need to think about our workforce and the communities that we engage in and the people that we impact and our customers, and those are people, or the third P. So we think about people, profit, and planet as being the triple bottom line. And what we found is that there's a number of research studies that have done that show that organizations that pay attention to all three of those can actually return greater profits because they're better thought of, their people are more engaged, people want to work for an organization that cares rather than is the uncaring automaton, and triple bottom line gives you a way to think about how can we do things that have an impact in what we do today and where we go in the future, leaving the planet. In another concept that we bring in here is the idea about sustainability, leaving the planet in a sustainable sense so that our children and grandchildren will have the same place to live in that we had and not have taken and ripped off all of the resources and left them an empty shell. So that's a key concept that drives some of the thinking behind corporate responsibility.
So these three legs really are intrinsically related to one another. Profitability, which used to be the sole focus, is really enhanced and made sustainable by the other two.
Absolutely. And we see it in the workforce where you say we want our workforce to be engaged, we want to keep and retain people, we want them to value coming to work, we want them to give us their very best, and that enhances our profitability. But we also see it in how we address the planet issues and address the broader issue of people. As Ron mentioned, people in our entire value chain. Do we have slave labor, or do we have people that are coerced into working in that value chain, whether we see them directly or whether they're hidden from us through a second or third tier supplier?
Mm-hmm. This whole section of the book, which is really the foundational part, features a number of terms and frameworks and constructs that help us really approach the topic in an organized way to look at how these enterprises function. But another aspect of the work you both did on this was to collect data on what businesses actually do. And you looked at this over time, starting with the original research, and then revisited it, I think, twice in the years since. Could I ask you both to share some of what you found? I think we'd like to know, do those who use and provide outsourcing services take these concepts seriously on a broad basis? And does the longitudinal research that you've been doing indicate that socially responsible approaches are increasing?
Let me start out, Steve, and Bill, I know you'll have some thoughts to add in. So just to put it in context, IAOP, our CSR subcommittee at IAOP, we conducted a survey in 2009, 2011, and 2014, and we've reported those results. We can talk more about that later. And as I mentioned, we use ISO 26000 to guide some of those questions. So what we found over the 3 years is that there was a growing both appreciation, understanding, and expectation of CSR features. And again, it was the outsourcing community. It's the IAOP community that we were surveying, and we had 150 responses or thereabouts each year. So it was reasonably representative, half from the United States, half from elsewhere in the world. What we have found, though, is that there seemed to be last survey, 2014, a bit of a plateau. You know, it had sort of reached a stable state of expectations, but a nice steady increase until we got to that point. And this was, it was reflected in maybe three perspectives that I want to speak to here. First, you know, companies ultimately sell to an end customer, you know, somebody who buys the service or purchases the product. And there was an increasing acknowledgement that end customers want to buy from companies or organizations that they view as trustworthy, as socially responsible. That's number one. Number two, outsourcing buyers, the people who hire IBM or hire TCS or CGI, they look to their suppliers with the expectation that the supplier or the outsourced provider will have the same level of CSR capability as the buyer does. So if the buyer subscribes to the UN Global Compact, they expect their provider to have that same level, so that, again, when they're speaking to the end customer, they can say that you know, CSR is regarded throughout the supply chain. So their expectations were growing, and I think we asked, is it critical, is it important, or do you ask for it all the time, or is it something that is mandatory in an RFP, for example? And then finally, the outsourcing providers, they were reflecting what the market is expecting of them, what their buyers are asking, and their ability and their responsiveness, their ability to deliver CSR was growing over the 3 years that we conducted the survey. And I might add, I mean, a lot of this is driven from a customer perspective, you know, what the customer expects. But at the same time, as we found in our case studies and as we were, you know, preparing the book, a lot of this helps internally. It helps to attract good employees, and it retains good employees because, you know, especially the millennials, the young people we're bringing into our organizations, they want to belong to an organization that both does good deeds or is socially responsible and is also seen to be a socially responsible organization. So that's those are some of the trends that we found in the data. But Bill, there's a whole lot there. Bill Heffley, you've probably got some other ideas to add into this.
Well, Ron, I wanted to build on what you said. Everything you said is absolutely spot on. We saw over time that more and more clients were saying that CSR as a component of their business strategy was becoming more and more crucial. And I would totally agree with you that many suppliers are echoing that response and responding to it. You know, in cross-cultural communication, we talk about mimicking the body language of the other person. You know, we see the same thing as clients start talking about CSR and start asking about it, providers start paying attention to it and start answering about it. But I would point out that there are some providers for whom CSR has been a long-standing activity and is something that they did because they see themselves as being able to give back in the places where they work, or in some cases, and this was geographically disparate in different geographies, we saw them giving back because they wanted to educate and grow the pipeline of talent that they're trying to hire and acquire. So one of the things that had come up in the chat a few minutes ago was some issues around resistance, and we did see over the years some resistance, and it was around the greater concerns were around three areas around resistance. One was the ongoing global political instability, just resistance to doing things because people are worried about the global instability and what's happening around the world. The other is the one that we saw, and we saw it worse in the 2004 election when we had the Benedict Arnold CEOs in the U.S., and that's the issue of protectionism. And that still is a concern to some and is a deciding point for some. But we're also seeing providers that are reaching out and growing in areas where we talk about something called impact sourcing. And impact sourcing is trying to do sourcing where we can have an impact in that local community or develop and grow talent. The Rockefeller Foundation, for example, has supported a great deal of work in impact sourcing, and their current initiative is called Digital Jobs Africa, trying to go into the underserved, underdeveloped communities in Africa and develop a workforce and a talent. But we also see impact sourcing activities going in rural America, where that addresses some of these resistance issues to protectionism. And we saw that over time there was a strong growth in that type of socially responsible outsourcing. To about 3/4 of the people that we had as respondents were very interested in that type of sourcing as a way to not only provide sourcing opportunities, but also do well while doing good, or do good while doing well. So they were looking at socially responsible outsourcing as an option for their sourcing activities.
Very good points. Steve, if I could add a little bit more before you get us to the next topic.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
sure.
and this is a different perspective on some of the research, but it applies to everything we're talking about, which is, in outsourcing, especially big, complex outsourcing that many on this call are familiar with. I know you are at IBM, Steve. We're dealing with all sorts of teams all over the place, all over the world in many cases. And our ability to govern, but more importantly, manage the relationship management, is founded on trust. And again, a lot of research that's been done on this topic, different parties, but CSR builds trust. And especially if you're able to team up between the buyer and the provider, between the outsourcer and the one who's receiving the service, collaborative CSR, common issues, whether it be helping small communities in rural U.S. or dealing with women in difficult parts of India, but combining forces to look at where we can make a difference in the world through the outsourcing relationship yields tremendous trust, respect for each other, and it's that giving back that Bill spoke about. It really binds the two organizations together. So back to you, Steve.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and we have found that, of course, at IBM. We operate in 178 countries, and all of these concepts are very important to the relationships we maintain with all of the communities in which we operate. I really like the idea, just as an HR practitioner, you were talking about sustainability. And when we hear that word very often, we automatically think of the green movement or environmental sustainability with respect to how we manage our raw materials. But the concept can be applied to one's workforce as well. Do we conserve the human resources under our care? Do we reinvest in them? There's a business reason for doing so because it reduces unwanted attrition, which is what one's clients want. So it supports the shareholders as well. So we see these ideas running together. They might come at it from a number of different perspectives, but they're supporting the same outcome. It's very interesting stuff. You mentioned a key element of this work has been the whole area of standards, establishing a standard that exemplifies the most effective socially responsible processes. And standards help us. They're prescriptive, so that we can literally figure out how would I do this and what standard can I measure myself against to see how I'm doing it. And of course, analysts can measure practitioners against it, and so can buyers. Could you tell us a little bit about ISO 26000 and how it came to be?
Bill, can you start on this one?
Let me jump in and start on this one, Ron. Thanks. ISO 26000, as with all international standards, was developed through the international participation process. But this one was very, very unique. Instead of just having countries represented in the standards making process, each country had to bring together stakeholders. And stakeholders included labor, government, special units or research organizations, consumers, and these parties all participated in the development of the standard across the globe. I was privileged as a researcher to be a member of the U.S. Technical Advisory Group, which is the national committee in the U.S. on the ISO 26000 standards development. So I was seeing the drafts as it developed and saw the work that was going on and saw the nations as they voted and moved forward. But Ron had mentioned there's a number of key issues that 26000 is developed around. And we looked at those issues. We've used those to frame our studies in IAOP. And it's interesting when you look at the list and then how much our community says they consider these issues in selecting providers. So the first of these is around labor practices. That dovetails very nicely with what Stephen was saying. Not only do we grow and develop and have good labor practices for ourselves, but what are the labor practices at our providers and second-tier and third-tier suppliers? And that ties in nicely with the California Transparency Act and the Modern Slavery Act out of the UK that Ron had mentioned earlier. And we saw that over 40% of organizations responding to our surveys used labor practices and labor activities as an evaluation criteria when they look at those outsourcing providers. The second is one that we've seen increasing regulatory and compliance pressures in the U.S., especially in the last few years, and that's around fair operating practices, around ethical conduct and anti-corruption. And we think about some of the legislation in that area, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We've recently had a company self-report to the DOJ because they paid a $547 fee to someone in a foreign country for some extra service, and they reported that anti-corruption activity. But fair operating practices, we saw that 40% of the organizations were concerned about those. Next in line, and these are in decreasing order of importance as reported to us by our respondents, was human rights. And that deals with things like discrimination and how we treat vulnerable and minority groups, disabled groups, those with disabilities. About 35% of organizations report that they use that criteria in looking at their providers. Slightly below that, just a tick or two, a point or two lower than that in being used in evaluating outsourcing providers was the issue that Stephen mentioned we typically think of sustainability around. That's environmental issues, things about pollution and sustainable resource use. And then consumer issues around consumer service, around data and privacy or privacy issues. And that was, again, about 33% of organizations say they care about that. And I would suspect that today, with the changes in the environment over the last year and a half or 2 years, and the number of extremely large data breaches that we've had, and then the latest issue around the multiple call centers that have been taken down in India by legal action, by police action, that this issue around privacy and treatment of consumer data might be more important to some organizations today. And the lowest of these was of these 6 issues in ISO 26000 that organizations said they evaluate their providers on is the one that, if you look at every organization and what they say they're doing in their philanthropy or social responsibility activities, they all say they're doing something. It's community involvement. It's what are we doing around the social impact of our work, the building of the employment pipelines, supporting education, supporting the communities in which we work. And we've had some great examples in the GOSRI award winners over the last several years. And I want to give a shout out to some of those organizations like CBRE and ISS and Accenture for the things they're doing, not only in human rights and labor practices, but also in community involvement, their actions to impact where they work and the communities that they work in.
And there are some excellent examples in the book and case studies as to how some of those companies went about achieving the results that they did in doing this. It's very, very good reading. So a lot of object lessons there as well. You know, you mentioned something I'd like to talk a little bit more about, which is the whole value chain and regulating the value chain. When we're in multiple countries or we have we're operating as a sort of a complex supply chain ecosystem, I have to deal with the fact that I may have alliance partners and subcontractors that may not take corporate responsibility as seriously as I do. And do you have anything in the research that identifies effective ways to meet a standard when you're functioning as part of an ecosystem?
Well, that's an interesting question, Steve, especially in the IBM world. I think as we've just talked, the existence of standards is of itself a mechanism to use in that conversation with different suppliers in different areas. The conversation might go something like this. It's important to our end customer, the big global customer corp. Therefore, it's important to us here at IBM or any outsourcer, and therefore it's got to be important to you, because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. So, it's not that we're making this up. We've got ISO 26000, we've got the UN Global Compact, we've got Global Reporting Initiative. We don't lack for standards, so it's critical that that A, they're understood, B, they're respected, and C, they're actually complied with. But let me back up a little bit, because I think we have to be careful. I mean, obviously, Bill and I and many of us on this call, we really believe in the importance of CSR. But when you're dealing in the competitive global outsourcing market, price and quality and fit, there are a number of criteria that are perhaps far more important than CSR when it comes down to selecting the right partner. But CSR is almost like a mandatory. You have to say, yeah, we've got it, and here's the evidence that we've got it. And that gets you onto the short list. And over time, that concept of fit, how well we work, how well we trust, how well we collaborate across our global value chain, that's what endures us. That's what keeps us at the client. And we renegotiate or we recommit to the client decade after decade after decade. And for those on the call that have been with a long-term outsourcing client, that it's the sort of the foundation aspects, and CSR is fundamental to that. So again, Steve, to your various suppliers throughout the world, if you're in it for the long haul, it's important to us, it's important to our client, and read the standards and get on board. A little bit harsh, but that would be my response.
Well, Ron, I want to build on that because I really like the way you started out by saying it's all about the conversation and that discussion and trust, because that's where it has to start. And I want to cycle back to the ISO 26000 standard for just a moment, because many of us are familiar with other standards, the ISO 9000 series around quality, for example. And many times you walk into a provider and you see hanging on the wall their ISO 9000 audit certificate that says they've been audited. ISO 26000 was the first standard that was developed out of the International Organization for Standards that specifically says in the standard, this is not to be used for audit. This is a guidance standard and should be used to help you have that conversation. Now, if I put on my regulatory or my compliance hat and try to answer Stephen's question, then I say, well, I want to have that conversation. I want to set up the relationship so we say that things like fair labor practices and anti-slavery and no child labor, those are all important things. And I want to have that discussion with my providers. I may want to have some of those things in my contracts, but then in those specific aspects, I may do audits, or I may ask the provider to provide audits that have been provided by other accrediting agencies, like those that audit against the Social Accountability 8000, the SA 8000 standard, which does get audited too. And so I may have that compliance or check mechanism in addition to that conversation, but I want to start with that conversation so we build common understanding and build that trust and understanding of what we expect as responsible individuals in the value chain.
Yeah, and sorry, Steve, let me, Bill and I are agreeing here quite strongly, but I'll make this statement, there are no CSR police. There's nobody who's going to come around and check an organization and, withhold their license to operate because they haven't complied with CSR policies. It's more of a commitment to, employees, to customers, to society. And I've often, used the phrase that CSR is insurance. You do it because it's important, and you'll find out in difficult situations whether you've got it or not, and you've got the respect from the community or not. And I'll give you one example. And some of you might see that and know that I'm from Toronto, and we had the largest bank in Canada, Royal Bank of Canada, RBC, that had a very difficult outsourcing discussion about social responsibility. It was April of 2013, and a very small situation about outsourcing to India, but it became a major public relations catastrophe that they were poorly prepared for. And it ended up with the CEO of the bank apologizing, complete apology to all the customers across Canada. So it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing to watch as well. But you don't perhaps really appreciate CSR until you realize that you don't have that capability within your organizations. So, Steve, that's sorry I got on a soapbox there, but this is important stuff, especially when you need it.
No, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think it's a very important topic. We can always slow down terms from a contract to a subcontract, and everybody's familiar with doing that. And then we've backed up from that, and as many have protocols for qualifying subcontractors who can play in our ecosystem, who share our values, who make these commitments. For us, that's good business. And so there are a number of ways that folks can go about it, but it can become increasingly difficult when you're operating in a number of different countries, and there are different expectations in the cultures in which you're operating. Perhaps when you're working with a new provider who's bringing a new skill in that you need in a new solution. One of the questions that's come in from the audience, and let me just make sure I can capture it here. A number of cross-cultural barriers between U.S. and European teams they're perceiving, and their Indian outsourcing providers. Teams don't always recognize how much impact those differences can have. What are you seeing in terms of cross-cultural barriers, and what actions are people taking in your experience to break through them to make sure that this kind of work could be generally accepted by teams?
Ron, I'll jump in there first if I can. I see that happening on a couple of different levels. One is going back to that conversation about practices and social responsibility that we were just discussing, having some understanding of the norms and behaviors. And I know the question was couched in terms of U.S. or Europe and Indian providers, but as an American, I've had the same issues going and doing consulting gigs in France, where their labor practices are different than what I'm used to. And having that conversation about the fact that we're going to go in and we're going to do an intensive audit, but the team can only be on site in the factory for 8 hours a day. And if the team wants to meet to discuss that day's results, they can't stay in the factory, do it after work. You have to go out to your hotel room and rent a conference room at the hotel and have those dialogues and discussions. And so that's just one example where the labor practices were different, and having that dialogue and that discussion about what's acceptable, what you want in the relationship, how you want it to work. But the other side of that is social responsibility and getting that cultural fit. It's not just an issue of social responsibility. It's an issue of how we work. And our work with the e-sourcing capability models, both for the service provider and the client organizations, and IBM and many of the other large providers were involved in developing that work with us. We addressed cultural fit as a key component of building that relationship and getting that work started so that you can understand how we're going to work together and what are the cultural differences. And it's sometimes as simple as just understanding what people mean or what they say when they say yes. Do they really mean yes? And I'll give you a great example of that. And Stephen, you'll laugh. The very first time I traveled to Japan on assignment was in the middle of an intensive 2 months of work, and I was exhausted. I flew into Japan in a beat-up pair of jeans and a T-shirt with some comic character on it. I was really dressed down, and I arrived in Tokyo, and they took me aside, and they totally unpacked my bag, and they got all the way down to the bottom of my bag, and they pulled out my box of business cards. And in Japan, you have to put you have your cards printed both sides, English and Japanese, but you can't just say PhD. You have to say what. So I had this extremely long PhD line that said PhD because I have a degree in 2 fields. And the customs agent looked at me, and he turned white, and he said, "Dr. Hefley-san, are you with IBM?" And I answered in proper Japanese, "Hi." And he immediately packed my bag much nicer than I had packed it. But it was this cultural thing. I did not look like an IBM consultant in scruffy jeans and flip.
Yes.
But
Sometimes we go undercover. We do.
Yes. It's okay. So having that discussion, setting those mutual expectations about how we're going to work, and understanding what it means for each other, in terms of how people respect different holidays, how they respect working hours, the practices that they accept, and being able to clearly communicate your expectations that no, we don't do things like pay service fees or processing fees, because that is not a fair operating practice, and it leaves us open to things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the U.S. And so being able to have that is a really important thing. Ron, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and actually this is a good segue to a little bit of new research that IAOP is looking into and is sponsoring a survey. So, for example, there are cultural varieties, of course, throughout the world, and in outsourcing that's been studied extensively. Language and mannerisms, and of course time zones. But there are certain bedrock fundamental principles that again, the UN Global Compact and Charter of Rights and that sort of thing recognize are a must-have across all worlds, all locations, et cetera. Slavery being one of them. The treatment of women in professional areas, and outsourcing being one of them, is a topic that IAOP is now exploring because it's a fascinating dichotomy. Both outsourcing has presented wonderful opportunities to women around the world, and I'm talking about developing nations, but at the same time there's a backlash or a challenge to that from the traditional cultural norms of that community, whether it be in Southeast Asia or India or Africa. And I think outsourcing has the ability to level the playing field and bring the global principles that we all recognize to different parts of the world. And have them respected. So women work in outsourcing. They get paid. They respect. They have responsibility, just like any other person in outsourcing. But that's not always necessarily the case. And again, I'm thankful and glad that IAOP is focusing on this issue.
I think the cultural stuff is always of great interest, and I'll offer you two observations. We've been talking about national cultural differences and the impact of what we do. But I know that in IBM South Africa many years ago, before apartheid was abolished, and we had managers, people in managerial positions who had the non-white classification that was part of the apartheid. It was having an impact on the culture. It's not just avoiding an adverse impact. It was actually creating a culture within a company that affects the culture within the country. And the second observation is just that these cultural realities and challenges that we have can happen just within a company. So within the company that you're providing services to, it's always important for us when we're doing a transaction that involves the delegation of work or the acceptance of work by an outsourced provider from a client, to work with the people who are affected employees and understand that culture. How do they communicate? How do they get their information? How can we design programs that make this entire project operate more smoothly in ways that are more respectful and therefore effective? So there are an awful lot of cultural things come up in the whole industry, in the outsourcing industry for us.
Well, it's really pushing the idea of the value. I was saying, Stephen, that really pushes the idea of the value chain, because our value chain is not just outsourcing customer to outsourcing provider, but it stretches all the way back to the end users or the business users who use us as clients to provide services to them or manage the outsourcing of services for them. And so there's cultural differences in all of those communities, and understanding those and being able to be a translator between them is an especially essential skill we expect of an outsourcing professional.
Mm-hmm. Someone has given, I think, a really pointed question. It's taking the subtext of my introduction and making it part of the text, and I think we should pay respect as one of our own, Darshan Kaur, one of our members of the Atlanta chapter. Given the rhetoric of the election, outsourcing gets a bad press. How should the outsourcing professionals address these concerns? We need some expert advice. I think what we've been talking about in general points to outsourcing practices and corporate social responsibility that are beneficial to the people who are affected by this. And I think we said at the beginning, which is everybody, right? Which is our customers, their employees, the bottom line, the shareholders. That's certainly one response, is to say that, well, there's a beneficial way to do it and a careless way to do it. And a great deal of thought's been done in our industry, in organizations like IAOP, to approach these things thoughtfully and with great care. But let me invite you guys to build on it from what you've seen in your own work.
Well, I'll start, Bill, and perhaps I'm speaking not as a citizen of the United States, but certainly appreciate these issues in the election. First of all, our topic here is about, I'll call it soft outsourcing, or IT and business process. Manufacturing and physical outsourcing is a whole different job, and I don't think we can address that in this call or in our studies. But it's a global workplace. And we're looking for best quality, of course. That's always a theme, and best price, I guess, to get the job done. But the concept that I think Bill touched on earlier, impact sourcing, but rural sourcing, and I don't know if Monty Hamilton is with us, but he has at least one company, Rural Shores USA, I believe. But the idea that there are underprivileged communities in Canada. I've looked at the Aboriginal, or the native community, and their ability to structure outsourcing. I think in any reasonable organization, American or Canadian or European, you should look at least in your own backyard to see what sort of local impact sourcing, where you can make a difference in a community. It doesn't have to be all of your outsourcing, but always pay attention to that, because when the protesters or the government or the news network wants to come and ask you about it, and say, well, look, we're helping. Again, my point earlier, it's a little bit like insurance, but take care of the people in your community as well as the global community. That would be part of my answer.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Well, I'd build on that and extend it a bit, because I'd go back to trying to draw some facts into the discussion. I know that there are those in this political climate who would rather ignore the facts, but one of the, and I've gone up onto the Hill in Washington, D.C. and met with congressional staffers on this topic, and one of the questions that I've often asked is, do you know who the largest net exporter of services in the world is? And invariably, you're dealing with some young congressional staffer, and they smile at you and said, oh, yes, I know that every job has been Bangalored. India is the largest exporter of services. And you look at them and say, no, you've fallen for misinformation or propaganda. The largest exporter of services in the world is the United States. We are a huge service engine. And if you look at the fact that the U.S. is providing services to the world, financial services, film and media services, other kinds of services, some jobs in outsourcing may have gone somewhere. They may have gone to Dubuque, Iowa, or they may have gone to Fargo, North Dakota, or to rural Virginia, but they certainly are not all going to India. And then when you think about the question here about how do we deal with the political fallout, the bad press, I think you need to look to some of the really good examples where we've been able to move people from a mundane job to free them up for more innovative tasks by taking some of that routine work and automating it or putting it with an outsourcer, where we're upskilling in workforces. A couple of ones that are in the headlines right now. AT&T's just come out again saying they're going to go through retraining and reeducation of 90% of their workforce in the next decade. The other one is acknowledge that there are bad apples in every barrel. I mentioned the current situation in Mumbai, which is not a social responsibility outsourcing issue, but it's an issue where outsourcing is going to get a bit of a black eye because there were 3 call centers over there that the Indian and U.S. authorities are now going after people who were running them because they were running the IRS tax scams out of those 3 call centers. And they were treating it like it was a business. Now, nobody outsourced it to them. They haven't identified a U.S. corporation that was saying, please do this outsourcing for us, and my business process is ripping off American elderly. But that will taint, but you need to be able to point at that and say, that is an example of a bad apple, and it's not representative of our entire industry.
Right. And which is a big challenge for people like yourselves, right, who've done specific fact-based information and assembled a body of knowledge about this, which is the way we approach and learn anything in a real way, to deal with the misinformation and the half information that troubles a lot of people, and it's just a steady diet in the press. So we're providing a service just today, all of us providing a service to focus on the facts. I wanted to move to something I did want to make sure we had a chance to talk about. Because sometimes it comes up when we're talking about these issues, and that's the expense of achieving and maintaining compliance with these kinds of standards. I've heard some people say, well, that's really just for large companies that have the budget to cover these kinds of investments. Do you have anything in the research in terms of large companies, small companies, the expense of doing this, or the payback of the kinds of investments that they represent?
Quick comment. I think that for sure there's some cost, some effort that's involved, but it's not onerous, and it doesn't have to be full compliance. But to read and understand the ISO standard or the UN Global Compact, you download it for $10 or $90, whatever, off the website. It does take some time, but it need not be onerous or full certification. Again, there are no CSR police, but you need to be able to speak to and attest and present your ability to embrace CSR in your outsourcing activities. And that needs to be structured according to the size of your organization. But in the survey, it does come up, we don't have enough budget, we don't have enough people to get this job done right.
Well, while they're saying that, though, Ron, the data that we have says that more organizations are going to be putting more emphasis on training their suppliers, which goes back to that dialogue we were talking about, as well as increasing their audits, either individually through their firms or through third-party auditors of their providers, to ensure that the providers are doing the things they said they've asked them to do. And there's more organizations that are willing to go out and hire external expertise to help them in this area because of the growing awareness that we need to do this. And as Ron said, it's almost insurance. We need to do this because if we don't, we risk serious compliance issues, which could have implications for our corporation. No
Yes.
corporation wants to go report an FCPA violation to Department of Justice and potentially pay the fines and have the kind of negative publicity that, for example, a Walmart had a couple of years ago with their actions in Mexico.
I agree completely, Bill.
Okay. It could be more costly not to comply and not to make these investments, not just rendering you, non-competitive, but in the legal penalties as well. A couple of things before I know we're sure.
Not only could it be more costly, but also doing these things. Actually, I used the phrase earlier about doing well and doing good. You can actually have an impact and do things in a really positive way that has repercussions throughout your value chain, as well as minimize those compliance issues. And that's a real strong positive.
It is. It's not unrelated to the sort of cyclical nature of the economic conditions, and I was wondering, and I'm not sure you would have been able to catch this given when you did your cycles of research, because the first was 2009. But I was wondering if there's any relationship between economic conditions and a commitment to corporate responsibility. Do we see this wane when chips are really down and companies are focusing on their bottom lines more?
I don't think we have any data on that. You're right, specifically, but that would be a gut reaction. It's like, training and education, corporate development are cut back when we're in a recession.
Right.
But I do want to say something, and that is, this is maybe just answering the question a couple of minutes ago. There's been some good evidence. I think IDC has done some of this and others that, outsourcing actually, for a country, it improves the opportunities for the country. It actually expands the economy as organizations and people shift to higher value focus opportunities. But no, sorry, don't have any data on CSR in a recession or in a downturn.
Okay. Well, maybe that's something we do in the future, but hopefully we won't have any downturns and we won't get to know. I did have something, I did want to ask you guys about, because, our audience and our whole organization is made up of providers, advisors, and consumers. And I thought of those three groups, I wondered which of them has, in your view or in your data, embraced the concept of corporate responsibility as a business measurement most fully. I'm always thinking of it as, from the provider's point of view, what I want to represent to my clients. Are advisors and consumers taking this up, or who's head of the pack of those three groups?
Yeah, I think the buyers, outsourcing buyers, have higher expectations, and the providers lag just a little bit. They're maybe a little bit skeptical, or they want to see the demonstration. But we've seen this over a couple of years now. The buyers have higher expectations, and the providers are actually capable of delivering.
Okay.
I would agree with that, and I think the issue of consultants, it really depends on the focus of the consultants and where they are, because they're like any other population, normally distributed.
Yes. Yeah, but having this as a standard as an additional qualification criteria for competitive RFPs and so on, is certainly something that I've seen it in the community of third parties, and would expect that to continue and to grow. I'm mindful of the time, and I wanted to make sure I had a chance to wrap this up and give a couple of key reminders if I can. First of all, Ron and Bill, thank you very much. I mean, the book for our listeners is The Outsourcing Professional's Guide to Corporate Responsibility. It's available through the IAOP website. It's a fascinating read, and it really will give you a new level of enthusiasm for the work we do and how it can be done well. And, as we suspected when we began to plan this topic, there's much more to talk about on this topic than we could fit into the time we had today. I hope all of you will join us when we reconvene on this subject with another panel of industry participants. We're going to do that on Wednesday, November 16th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And in the meantime, I'd like to thank all of our participants and our panelists, and may we all continue to make contributions to this industry with energy, and after today's program, I hope with renewed pride. Thank you, everybody.
Steve, thanks. It's been a pleasure to speak here.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks, everyone. This has been a great opportunity, and I look forward to working with many of you as we go down this journey together.
Thank you all.